Today we have some more actual history about the United States Revolutionary War. We will be reading about the Siege of Charleston of 1780. This was where a small group of regulars and militia tried to save the town of Charleston from a British bombardment. We will be reading from this book, Kings Mountain and Its Heroes, by Lyman C. Draper. This book was published all the way back in 1881. So in this story, we are first going to briefly hear about the first 5 years of the war, from 1775 through 1779. As the book says, despite all their efforts, the British had been unable to gain a foothold in the colonies during this time. We will then hear about the British effort to make South Carolina their next major front in the war. As you will see, many American patriots died in their persistent and determined defense of Charleston. For 10 years before the outbreak of the American Revolution, the great question of taxation without representation agitated the minds of the American people. They rejected the stamps because they implied a tax. They destroyed the tea because it imposed a forced levy upon them without their consent, to gratify the insatiate demands of their transatlantic sovereign and his tyrannical ministry and parliament. Should they basely yield one of their dearest rights, they well judged they might be required little by little to yield all. They therefore manfully resisted these invasions as unbecoming a free people. When in 1775 Great Britain determined to enforce her obnoxious laws, the people under their chosen leaders seized their arms, forsook their homes and families, and boldly asserted their God-given rights. A long and embittered contest was commenced, involving mighty interests. Freedom was threatened, an empire was at stake. Sturdy blows were given and received with various results. The first year of the war, the Americans beat back the British from Lexington and Concord, and captured Crown Point, but were worsted at Bunker Hill. They captured Chambly and St. John's and repulsed the enemy at Longueuil. But the intrepid Montgomery failed to take Quebec, losing his life in the effort. The second year of the contest, which brought forth the immortal Declaration of Independence, proved varying in its fortunes. The Scotch Tories in North Carolina were signally defeated at Moore's Creek, and the British, long cooped up in Boston, were compelled to evacuate the place, and were subsequently repulsed at Sullivan's Island near Charleston, while the Americans, on the other hand, were defeated at the Cedars, and were driven from Montreal, Chambly, and St. John's, worsted at Long Island and White Plains, and lost Fort Washington on the Hudson. Meanwhile, the frontier men of Virginia, the Carolinas, East Tennessee, and Georgia carried on successful expeditions against the troublesome Cherokees, whom British emissaries had inveigled into hostilities against their white neighbors. Yet the year closed with gloomy prospects. Despair sat on many a brow, and saddened many a heart. The main army was greatly reduced, and the British occupied New York and the neighboring province of New Jersey. Washington made a desperate venture crossing the Delaware amid floating ice in December, attacking and defeating the unsuspecting enemy at Trenton, and pushing his good fortune commenced the third year of the war 1777 by securing a victory at Princeton. While the enemy were for a while held at bay at the Red Bank, yet the results of the contests at Brandywine and Germantown were not encouraging to the American arms, and the British gained a firm foothold in Philadelphia, and subsequently they captured Forts Clinton and Montgomery on the Hudson. Farther north, better success attended the American arms. St. Leger, with a strong British and Indian force, laid siege to Fort Stanwix on the Mohawk. But after repelling a relieving party under General Herkimer, he was at length compelled to relinquish his investiture on learning of the approach of a second army of relief, retiring precipitately from the country, while the more formidable invading force under Burgoyne met with successive reverses at Bennington, Stillwater, and Saratoga, eventuating in its total surrender to the victorious Americans. In June of 1778, the fourth year of the war, the British evacuated Philadelphia, when Washington pursued their retreating forces, overtaking and vigorously attacking them at Monmouth. A large Tory and Indian party defeated the settlers, and laid waste the Wyoming settlements. As the result of Burgoyne's signal discomfiture, a treaty of alliance between the new republic and France brought troops and fleets to the aid of the struggling Americans, and produced some indecisive fighting on Rhode Island. Varied fortunes attended the military operations of 1779, the fifth year of the strife. The British force in Georgia, having defeated General Ashe at Briar Creek, projected an expedition against Charleston, and progressed as far as Stono, whence they were driven back to Savannah, where the combined French and Americans were subsequently repulsed, losing among others the chivalrous Count Pulaski. At the north, Stony Point was captured at the point of the bayonets, and Paulus Hook surprised. The war had now dragged its slow length along for 5 successive campaigns, and the British had gained but few permanent footholds in the revolted colonies. Instead of the prompt and easy conquest they had promised themselves, they had encountered determined opposition wherever they had shown the Red Cross of St. George, or displayed their red-coated soldiery. Repeated defeats on the part of the Americans had served to inure them to the hardships of war, and learned them how to profit by their experiences and disasters. New efforts were demanded on the part of the British government to subdue their rebellious subjects, and South Carolina was chosen as the next field of extensive operations. Sir Henry Clinton, who had met so signal a repulse at Charleston in 1776, and in whose breast still rankled the mortifying recollections of that memorable failure, resolved to head in person the new expedition against the Palmetto colony, and retrieve, if possible, the honor so conspicuously tarnished there on his previous unfortunate enterprise. Having enjoyed the Christmas holiday of 1779 in New York Harbor, Sir Henry, accompanied by Lord Cornwallis, sailed from Sandy Hook the next day, with a fleet under Admiral Arbuthnot, transporting an army of over 7,500 men. Some of the vessels, however, were lost by the way, having encountered stormy weather in the Gulf Stream. One bark carrying Hessian troops was dismasted and driven across the ocean. An ordnance vessel was foundered, while several transports were captured by bold and adventurous American privateers, and most of the horses for the expedition perished. The place of rendezvous was at Tybee Bay, near the entrance to Savannah River, whence Clinton, on his way towards Charleston, was joined by the troops in Georgia, making his force 9,000 strong, besides the sailors in the fleets. But to render his numbers invincible beyond all peradventure, he at once ordered from New York Lord Rawdon's brigade, amounting to about 2,500 more. Charleston, against which this formidable British force was destined, was an opulent city of some 15,000 people, white and black, and was garrisoned by less than 4,000 men, not near enough to properly man the extended works of defense of nearly 3 miles in circumference as they demanded. Governor Rutledge, a man of unquestioned patriotism, had conferred upon him by the legislature, in anticipation of this threatened attack, dictatorial powers with the admonition to do everything necessary for the public good, but he was nevertheless practically powerless. He had few or none of the sinews of war, and so depreciated had become the currency of South Carolina that it required $700 to purchase a pair of shoes for one of her needy soldiers. The defeat of the combined French and American force at Savannah the preceding autumn, in which the South Carolinians largely participated, had greatly dispirited the people, and the governor's appeal to the militia produced very little effect. The 6 old South Carolina regiments had been so depleted by sickness and the casualties of war as to scarcely number 800 all told, and the defense of the city was committed to these brave men, the local militia, and a few regiments of Continental troops, the latter reluctantly spared by Washington from the main army, and which he thought was putting much to hazard in an attempt to defend the city, and the result proved his military foresight. It would have been wiser for General Lincoln and his troops to have retired from the place and engaged in a Fabian warfare, harassing the enemy's marches by ambuscades and cutting off his foraging parties. But the leading citizens of Charleston, relying on their former success, urged every argument in their power that the city should be defended to the last extremity. Yet no experienced engineer regarded the place as tenable. On the 11th of February, 1780, the British forces landed on St. John's Island, within 30 miles of Charleston, subsequently forming a depot and building fortifications at Wappoo on James's Island. And on the 26th of that month, they gained a distant view of the place and harbor. The dreaded day of danger approached nearer and nearer, and on the 27th the officers of the Continental Squadron, which carried 150 guns, reported their inability to guard the harbor at the bar, where the best defense could be made. And then, as Washington expressed it, the attempt to defend the town ought to have been relinquished. But no such thought was entertained. Everything was done that could be done to strengthen and extend the lines of defense, dig ditches, erect redoubts, and plant abattis with a strong citadel in the center. Preparations, too, were steadily progressing on the part of the enemy. On the 24th of March, Lord Cornwallis and a Hessian officer were seen with their spyglasses making observations, and on the 29th the British passed Ashley River, breaking ground on the 1st of April, at a distance of 1,100 yards from the American lines. At successive periods they erected 5 batteries on Charleston Neck. Late in the evening of March 30th, General Charles Scott, commanding one of the Virginia Continental Brigade, arrived accompanied by his staff and some other officers. The next morning, says Major Croghan, I accompanied Generals Lincoln and Scott to view the batteries and works around town. Found those on the Cooper River side in pretty good order, and chiefly manned by sailors, but the greater part of the remainder not complete, and stood in need of a great deal of work. Admiral Arbuthnot's near approach to the bar on the 7th of April induced Commodore Whipple, who commanded the American naval force, to retire without firing a gun, first to Fort Moultrie and afterward to Charleston, and the British fleet passed the fort without stopping to engage it. The passage having been made, says the New Jersey Gazette, while a severe thunderstorm was raging, which caused the ships to be invisible near half the time of their passing. Colonel Charles C. Pinckney, who commanded there, with 300 men, kept up a heavy cannonade of the British ships during their passage, which was returned by each of the vessels as they passed, the enemy losing 14 men killed and 15 wounded, while not a man was hurt in the garrison. One ship had its foretop masts shot away, and others sustained damage. The Royal fleet, in about 2 hours, came to anchor within long shot of the American batteries. By the 10th of April, the enemy had completed their first parallel, when Clinton and Arbuthnot summoned the town to surrender. Lincoln answered, "From duty and inclination, I shall support the town to the last extremity." The British had the decided advantage in the number and strength of their mortars and royals, having 21, while the Americans possessed only 2, and the lines of the latter soon began to crumble under the powerful and constant cannonade maintained against them. On the 13th of April, Governor Rutledge was persuaded to withdraw from the garrison, while exit was yet attainable, leaving Lieutenant Governor Gadsden with 5 members of the council. On the same day, General Lincoln, in a council of war, revealed to its members his want of resources and suggested an evacuation. "In such circumstances," said General McIntosh, "we should lose not an hour in attempting to get the Continental troops at least over Cooper River, for on their safety depends the salvation of the state." But Lincoln only wished them to give the matter mature consideration, and he would consult them further about it. Before he met them again, the American cavalry at Monk's Corner, which had been relied on to keep open the communication between the city and the country, were surprised and dispersed on the 14th, and 5 days later the expected British reinforcements of 2,500 men arrived from New York. When Clinton was enabled more completely to environ the devoted city and cut off all chance of escape, a stormy council was held on the 19th, when the heads of the several military departments reported their respective conditions, of course anything but flattering in their character. Several of the members still inclined to an evacuation, notwithstanding the increased difficulties of effecting it since it was first suggested. In the midst of the conference, Lieutenant Governor Gadsden happened to come in, whether by accident or design was not known, and General Lincoln courteously proposed that he be allowed to take part in the council. He appeared surprised and displeased that a thought had been entertained of either evacuation or capitulation, and acknowledged himself entirely ignorant of the state of the provisions, etc., but would consult his council in regard to the proposals suggested. In the evening, an adjourned meeting was held when Colonel Lemoy of the Engineer Department reported the insufficiency of the fortifications, the improbability of holding out many days longer, and the impracticability of making a retreat, and closed by suggesting that terms of honorable capitulation be sought from the enemy. Lieutenant Governor Gadsden, with 4 of his counselors coming in shortly after, treated the military gentlemen very rudely, the lieutenant governor declaring that he would protest against their proceedings, that the militia were willing to live upon rice alone, rather than give up the town on any terms, and that even the old women had become so accustomed to the enemy's shot that they traveled the streets without fear or dread. But if the council were determined to capitulate, he had his terms ready in his pockets. It is very certain that these suggestions of evacuation or capitulation occasioned at the time great discontent among both the regulars and the militia, who wished to defend the city to the last extremity, and who resolved, in view of continuing the defense, that they would be content, if necessary, with only half rations daily. All these good people had their wishes gratified. The siege was procrastinated, and many additional death, suffering, sorrow, and anguish were the consequence. Looking at these bickerings in light of history, a century after their occurrence, one is struck with General Lincoln's magnanimous forbearance, when he confessedly made great sacrifices in defending the place so long against his better judgment. In deference to the wishes of the people, who, we may well conclude, were very unfit judges of military affairs, the Americans were not slow in perceiving the utter hopelessness of their situation. On the 26th, General Duportail, an able French officer and engineer-in-chief of the American army, arrived from Philadelphia, having been sent by Washington to supervise the engineer department. He frankly informed General Lincoln that there was no prospect of getting any reinforcements very soon from the Grand Army, that Congress had proposed to General Washington to send the Maryland line to their relief. As soon as General Duportail came into the garrison, examined the military works, and observed the enemy, he declared the defenses were not tenable, that they were only field lines, and that the British might have taken the place 10 days ago. "I found the town," wrote Duportail to Washington, "in a desperate state." He wished to leave the garrison immediately while it was possible, but General Lincoln would not allow him to do so, as it would dispirit the troops. On learning General Duportail's opinion, a council of war was called the same day, and a proposition made for the Continental troops to make a night retreat. And when the citizens were informed of the subject under deliberation, some of them came into the council, warmly declaring to General Lincoln that if he attempted to withdraw the troops and abandon the citizens, they would cut up his boats and open the gates to the enemy. This put an end to all further thoughts of an evacuation. As late as the 28th of April, a supernumerary officer left town to join the forces in the country, but the next day the small party remaining at Lempriere's Point was recalled, the enemy at once occupying it with a large force, and thus the last avenue between the city and the country was closed. And on the 30th, in some way, Governor Rutledge managed to convey a letter to General Lincoln, upon which the general congratulated the army in general orders, on hearing of a large reinforcement, which may again open the communication with the country. It was the old story of drowning men catching at straws. 11 vessels were sunk in the channel to prevent the royal fleet from passing up Cooper River and enfilading the American lines on that side of the place, while a frigate and 2 galleys were placed above the sunken obstructions to cooperate with the shore batteries in thwarting any attempt on the part of the enemy for their removal. But the work of destruction went steadily on. Cannonballs by day and by night went streaking through the air and crashing through the houses. One morning a shell burst very near Colonel Parker, a large piece of which fell harmless at his feet, when he said, with much composure, "A miss is as good as a mile." And that very evening, while the gallant colonel was looking over the parapet, he was shot dead. Shells, fireballs, and carcasses ingeniously packed with combustibles, loaded pistol barrels, and other destructive missiles, were thrown into the city, setting many buildings on fire and maiming and destroying not a few of the citizens and soldiery. On one occasion, when a pastor and a few worshippers, mostly women and invalids, were gathered in a church, supplicating the mercies of heaven on themselves and a suffering people, a bombshell fell in the churchyard, when all quickly dispersed, retiring to their several places of abode. Some of the cases of fatality were quite uncommon. A soldier who had been relieved from serving at his post in defense of the city entered his humble domicile, and while in the act of embracing his anxious wife with tears of gladness, a cannonball passed through their house, killing them both instantly. General Moultrie has left us a vivid picture of this period of the siege. Mr. Lord and Mr. Basquin, 2 volunteers, were sleeping upon the mattress together in the advanced redoubt, when Mr. Lord was killed by a shell falling upon him, and Mr. Basquin at the same time had the hair of his head burnt, and did not awake until he was aroused from his slumbers by his fellow soldiers. The fatigue in that advanced redoubt was so great for want of sleep, that many faces were so swelled they could scarcely see out of their eyes. Under the date of the 2nd of May, Major Croghan records in his journal, which is corroborated by General McIntosh's diary, that the enemy threw shells charged with rice and sugar. Sims tells us that tradition has it that it was not rice and sugar with which the shells of the British were thus ironically charged, but wheat flour and molasses, with an inscription addressed, "To the Yankee officers in Charleston," courteously informing them that it contained a supply of the commodities of which they were supposed to stand most in need. But the garrison could still jest amid suffering, volcanoes, and death. Having ascertained that the shell was sent from a battery manned exclusively by a Scottish force, they emptied the shell of its contents, and filling it with lard and sulphur to cure them of the itch, and sent it back to their courteous assailants, with the same inscription which originally accompanied it. It was understood, says Garden, after the siege, that the note was received, but not with that good humor that might have been expected, had it been considered as a joie de spirit resulting from justifiable retaliation. Clinton, on the 6th of May, renewed his former terms for the surrender of the garrison. With the limited store of provisions on hand, with no prospects of receiving further supplies or reinforcements, and with the admission on the part of the engineers that the lines could not be maintained 10 days longer, and were liable to be carried by assault at any time, General Lincoln was disposed to accept the terms tendered. But he was opposed by the citizens, as they were required by Clinton to be prisoners on parole, when they wished to be regarded as non-combatants, and not subject to the rigorous laws of war. It was only putting off the evil day for a brief period. And again the 24 and 32-pound cannonades, the mortars and howitzers, belched forth their shot, shell, and carcasses upon the devoted town and garrison, setting many buildings on fire and keeping up the most intense excitement. So near were now the opposing parties that they could speak words of bravado to each other, and the rifles of the Hessian Jaegers were so unerring that a defender could no longer show himself above the lines with safety, and even a hat raised upon a ramrod was instantly riddled with bullets. Captain Hudson of the British Navy on the 5th of May summoned Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island to surrender, the larger portion of its garrison having previously retired to Charleston. Lieutenant Colonel William Scott, who commanded, sent for answer a rollicking reply, "Tolo de Rolo, Fort Moultrie will be defended to the last extremity." The next day Hudson repeated his demand, threatening that if he did not receive an answer in 15 minutes, he would storm the fort and put every man to the sword. Scott, it would seem, was at first disposed to resort to bravado of the last extremity character, but recalled the officer bearing it, saying on further reflection, the garrison thought better of it, the disparity of force was far too great, and begging for a cessation of hostilities, proposed terms of surrender, which were granted by Captain Hudson. The surrender formally took place on the 7th. Thus the historic Fort Moultrie, which 4 years before had signally repulsed a powerful British fleet under Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, now surrendered to the enemy without firing a gun. The 7th of May was further noted by an unfortunate disaster, the partial destruction of the principal magazine of the garrison by the bursting of a shell. General Moultrie had most of the powder, 10,000 pounds, removed to the northeast corner of the exchange, where it was carefully bricked up and remained undiscovered by the British during the 2 years and 7 months they occupied the city. Another summons was sent in by Clinton on the 8th. A truce was granted till the next day, when Lincoln endeavored to secure the militia from being considered as prisoners of war, and the protection of the citizens of South Carolina in their lives and property, with 12 months' allowance of time in which to determine whether to remain under British rule or dispose of their effects and remove elsewhere. These articles were promptly rejected, with the announcement on the part of Clinton that hostilities would be recommenced at 8 o'clock that evening. After receiving his letter, says Moultrie, we remained near an hour silent, all calm and ready, each waiting for the other to begin. At length we fired the first gun, and immediately followed a tremendous cannonade. About 200 pieces of heavy cannon were discharged at the same moment. The mortars from both sides threw out an immense number of shells. It was a glorious sight to see them, like meteors crossing each other and bursting in the air. It appeared as if the stars were tumbling down. The fire was incessant almost the whole night, cannonballs whizzing, the shells hissing continually among us, ammunition chests and temporary magazines blowing up, great guns bursting, and wounded men groaning along the lines. It was a dreadful night. It was our last great effort, but it availed us nothing. After it, our military ardor was much abated, and we began to cool. When on the 11th of May the British had crossed the wet ditch by Sap, and were within 25 yards of the American lines, all further defense was hopeless. The militia refused to do duty. It was no longer a question of expediency, but stern necessity demanded a speedy surrender, and the stoppage of further carnage and suffering. General Lincoln had proved himself brave, judicious, and unwearied in his exertions for 3 anxious months, in baffling the greatly superior force of Sir Henry Clinton and Admiral Arbuthnot. Hitherto the civil authorities and citizens of Charleston had stoutly contended that the city should be defended to the last extremity. But now, when all hope was lost, a large majority of the inhabitants and of the militia petitioned General Lincoln to accede to the terms offered by the enemy. The next day, articles of capitulation were signed. The loss of the Americans during the siege was 98 officers and soldiers killed, and 146 wounded. And about 20 of the citizens were killed by random shots of the enemy. Upward of 30 houses were burned, and many others greatly damaged. Besides the Continental troops, less than 2,000, of whom 500 were in hospitals, and a considerable number of sailors, Sir Henry Clinton managed to enumerate among the prisoners surrendered all the free male adults of Charleston, including the aged, the infirm, and even the loyalists, so as to swell the number of his formidable conquest. In this way, his report was made to boast of over 5,600 prisoners, when the Loyalist portion, but a few days afterwards, offered their congratulations to the reduction of South Carolina. The regular troops and sailors became prisoners of war until exchanged. The militia from the country were permitted to return home on parole, and to be secured in their property, so long as their parole should be observed. So that's it for this episode. This video will be released on Memorial Day, and there are certainly many soldiers who died trying to defend Charleston from this British bombardment back in May of 1780. We all know the final outcome of the Revolutionary War, but at this time things look somewhat grim for the Patriot cause. We will likely read more from this book, Kings Mountain and its Heroes, in future episodes on this channel. This was the beginning of the invasion of South Carolina that would culminate in the Battle of Kings Mountain about 5 months later, in October of 1780. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV. Those channels typically play reality shows about aliens or going to garage sales, but on special holidays like Memorial Day, they occasionally show actual history. Here on this channel, we are devoted exclusively to keeping actual history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to join our mission here at Unworthy History, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will also have access to special members-only videos. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.